Tiffany was 68 when the first real scare happened. She had been standing at the kitchen counter preparing breakfast when the sudden wave of dizziness hit her. Her hands trembled as she tried to grip the edge of the counter, and for a brief second, she feared she might collapse right there on the cool tile floor. Later that morning, her doctor explained that her blood sugar had spiked again, and her blood pressure was running higher than it should. It wasn't yet an emergency, but the warning was clear. Her body was asking for change. For weeks afterward, Tiffany felt the shadow of that moment follow her. Even in the quiet hours of the evening, when she sat with her knitting or read the newspaper, the memory of her weakness crept back. She wondered if this was what the years ahead would hold: more fatigue, more pills, more fear of the next unexpected spell. Her children urged her to be careful, but she hated the thought of becoming a burden. Tiffany had always been strong, the kind of woman who raised her family on determination and faith. To feel her body slipping away frightened her more than she let on. It was during one of those restless nights, scrolling through stories of natural remedies and senior health, that she stumbled across something curious. An old article described how Roman soldiers carried a sour, golden liquid into battle, and how samurai in Japan drank it before stepping onto the training grounds. The name was familiar enough, apple cider vinegar, but the stories gave it an almost mystical quality. Could something so simple, sitting quietly on her kitchen shelf, really have carried such weight through centuries? Tiffany smiled at the thought, but the seed was planted. The next morning, she pulled out the small glass bottle tucked behind her olive oil. She poured just a spoonful into a cup of warm water, wrinkling her nose at the sharp scent. 1 tablespoon, she whispered to herself, remembering the words she had read. It felt almost ceremonial, as though she were making a small pact with her own body. That first sip was far from pleasant, but it carried with it a spark of hope, an act of defiance against the weakness she feared was overtaking her. Days turned into weeks, and Tiffany began to notice small changes that felt surprisingly profound. The heaviness after meals lessened, and she no longer dreaded the sluggish afternoons. Her doctor, at her next visit, noted her blood sugar had evened out, her pressure not quite so high. But what mattered more than numbers was how she felt when she looked in the mirror. Her face a little brighter, her hair less dull, her spirit lighter. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't overnight, but there was a steadiness returning to her steps. She began to walk more, laugh more, even sleep more soundly. I remember the day she told me about it. She leaned forward, her eyes full of quiet wonder, and said, "Doctor, I never thought something so ordinary could give me back my strength." To Tiffany, it wasn't just vinegar anymore. It was a reminder that healing doesn't always arrive in grand, complicated ways. Sometimes it's hidden in a spoonful of courage, taken at the right moment, every day. And as I listened to her, I realized her story was not only about health, but about hope, about believing that even as we grow older, change is still possible. Tiffany had always loved her kitchen. It wasn't just a place to cook, it was where she felt most herself. The shelves carried not only jars and spices, but memories of family dinners, holiday pies, and Sunday mornings filled with laughter. Yet lately, when she stood at the counter, she felt a dull ache of fatigue. Her body no longer carried the same energy it once had, and her reflection in the glass window often reminded her of years that had passed more quickly than she wished. On one of those tired mornings, while pushing aside a bottle of olive oil to find the tea bags, her hand brushed against a forgotten glass bottle with a golden liquid inside. She pulled it forward, squinting at the label, apple cider vinegar. It had been there for so long she couldn't remember when she bought it, maybe years ago to make a salad dressing. She thought about throwing it out, but a memory stirred, something she had read not long ago about its unusual past. Roman soldiers carried vinegar in their packs, not just to flavor food, but to drink before battle. Samurai warriors in Japan were said to take it as a tonic before training. It seemed strange that the same liquid she used once or twice for salad might have been trusted for strength, healing, even survival. That evening, still restless from her doctor's warning about her blood sugar, Tiffany sat at the table with the bottle in front of her. The sharp smell filled the air when she twisted the cap, and for a moment she almost laughed. "How could something so ordinary matter?" she whispered. But the thought of warriors and healers from centuries past stayed with her. Maybe it wasn't about miracles or fads, maybe it was about small habits, simple and ancient, that carried hidden wisdom. The next morning, Tiffany poured a single spoonful into a glass of warm water. The taste was harsh, almost biting, and she winced as it slid down her throat. Yet when she set the glass down, she felt something different. Maybe not in her body yet, but in her spirit. It was as if she had taken a step forward, a choice to believe that she could change the story her body had been writing for her. It wasn't the vinegar itself she trusted at first. It was the decision to try to begin again, even at 68. In the days that followed, Tiffany found herself thinking about the connection between the past and the present. She read that vinegar had been used not only in kitchens, but in medicine cabinets across ancient cultures. Its fermentation, rich with natural acids and enzymes, wasn't just a flavor. It carried properties that eased digestion, settled heavy stomachs, and gave weary bodies a kind of quiet strength. As she reflected on her own bloating after meals, the sluggish afternoons, the heaviness that crept in, she wondered if this was what those ancient healers saw too. Perhaps it wasn't magic, but balance, helping the body settle itself in ways modern medicine sometimes overlooked. Her daughter Anna noticed the bottle on the counter one afternoon. "Are you actually drinking that stuff, Mom?" she asked, half laughing. Tiffany smiled, a little sheepish, but also proud. "Just a spoonful each morning," she replied. Anna shook her head, amused, but Tiffany could see in her eyes a quiet relief. Maybe her daughter thought she was being silly, but she also knew her mother was trying not to give up, not to sink into fear or resignation. That mattered. By the end of the week, Tiffany noticed small shifts. Her mornings didn't feel quite as heavy. The after-meal drowsiness seemed less sharp, as though her body had begun to digest with more ease. Whether it was real or just her imagination, she didn't care. She found herself standing taller in the kitchen, humming as she poured her spoonful and thinking of the soldiers, the healers, the samurai who had trusted this same liquid long before her. In some way, it made her feel less alone, part of a longer story of people who had looked to nature for strength. That ancient secret, hidden in plain sight on her shelf, had become something more than vinegar. It was a reminder that healing can live quietly, waiting for us to notice, waiting for us to believe. And for Tiffany, that belief was already reshaping her days, one small sip at a time. It had only been 2 weeks since Tiffany began her small morning ritual, but already she felt a quiet difference. The spoonful of vinegar, diluted in warm water, had gone from a sharp, sour shock to something she almost welcomed. Each morning, she carried the glass to her favorite chair near the window, watching the light slip between the curtains as she sipped slowly. It wasn't the flavor she had grown to like, it was the promise it carried, a reminder that at 68, she still had the power to shift the course of her days. Her family didn't understand it at first. Anna teased her now and then, asking if she was starting a new witch's brew trend. But Tiffany noticed the small changes that no one else could feel. The steadiness in her energy, the way her hands no longer trembled as often, and the fog that used to linger in her mornings seemed to lift more quickly. For years, she had accepted those dizzy spells, those waves of weakness as just part of getting older. But this felt different. It was as if her body was thanking her for choosing something simple, something natural. One evening at a family dinner, Tiffany's son-in-law asked how she had been feeling. She hesitated, then admitted, "I don't tire out as quickly anymore. Even after a big meal, I feel lighter somehow." He nodded politely, not knowing what to say, but Anna glanced at her mother with a look of surprise. It wasn't a miracle, Tiffany thought to herself. It was just one spoon, but it was enough to change how she faced her days. The truth was, Tiffany's doctor had been worried about her blood sugar for years. She remembered the lectures, the warnings about diabetes, the talks about medication. And though she was never reckless with her health, she also knew she hadn't been consistent with her habits. But now, she had read that the acids in apple cider vinegar could help her body slow the absorption of sugars, keeping her glucose more steady. For Tiffany, this wasn't science to memorize, it was something she could feel. The dizzy rushes weren't as sharp and the afternoon crashes weren't as heavy. It gave her courage, like she was regaining control over a part of herself she thought was lost. One morning, Tiffany took her vinegar at the window as usual, and when she set the glass down, she caught her reflection in the glass pane. Her face was still lined, her hair still streaked with silver, but there was something different in her eyes. A spark. She realized that change after 60 wasn't about turning back time. It was about moving forward with grace, strength, and choice. That one spoon each day was teaching her something larger than health facts. It was teaching her that she wasn't powerless no matter what the years had taken. When she saw her doctor again a month later, the checkup felt different. The numbers weren't perfect, but they were steadier, calmer. The doctor raised his eyebrows as he glanced at the chart. "You've made progress," he said softly. Tiffany smiled, holding back the urge to explain her little ritual. It wasn't that she wanted to hide it, she just knew that no one else could understand the way it had touched not only her body, but her spirit. That night, she called her sister Margaret, who lived 2 towns away. They talked about the aches and struggles that had come with their age, about the quiet fear of losing independence. Tiffany hesitated, then told her about the vinegar. Margaret laughed at first, but Tiffany's voice held steady. "I'm not saying it's magic, but it feels like it gave me back a little part of myself." There was silence on the other end of the line, then Margaret whispered, "That's all we really want, isn't it? To feel like ourselves again." In that moment, Tiffany understood why she kept going with her little glass each morning. It wasn't just the digestion, the blood sugar, the steadier energy. It was the reminder that even after 60, one small change could ripple through her life like sunlight spilling across a dark room. And for Tiffany, that was enough to keep sipping. Tiffany often found herself smiling at the thought that she now shared a habit with soldiers and samurai. She had never considered herself particularly strong. She was a grandmother, a widow, a woman who spent most of her days tending the garden and knitting blankets for church drives. Yet when she held that warm glass each morning, she imagined the Roman legionnaires who once sipped the same sharp liquid before marching into battle. There was comfort in knowing she wasn't alone, that what she was doing had been done for centuries, by people who sought strength in simple things. She read once that vinegar was carried by travelers on long journeys, used not only for sustenance but for protection against illness. The story lingered in her mind during her evening walks through the neighborhood. She thought about how the world may have changed, cars instead of horses, medicine cabinets instead of herbal tonics, but the needs were the same. Bodies still grew tired, hearts still strained, and people still searched for ways to keep moving forward. That continuity made her ritual feel timeless, almost sacred. One afternoon, her grandson Ethan sat at the table watching her mix her vinegar into a glass of water. He wrinkled his nose and asked, "Grandma, why do you drink that stuff if it smells so bad?" Tiffany laughed, stirring the spoon, because sometimes the things that don't seem pleasant at first can make us stronger. Ethan shrugged, unconvinced, but she saw a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. It wasn't just about health anymore, it was about passing on a story, a thread of resilience that stretched from warriors to mothers to grandmothers. Her doctor had once explained that apple cider vinegar carried antioxidants, compounds that fought against the invisible wear and tear of life. Tiffany didn't think much about antioxidants in scientific terms, but she understood the way her heart had felt lighter lately, the way her breath came easier after climbing the porch steps. Perhaps those little molecules really were working quietly inside her, guarding her heart the way shields once guarded warriors. The thought made her chuckle softly. She'd never been one for battles, yet here she was, a quiet soldier in her own way. Margaret, her sister, called one evening and confessed she had begun her own experiment with vinegar. "I can't say I enjoy it," she admitted, "but I feel steadier somehow." Tiffany smiled at the phone, proud of her sister for trying. Together they talked about their mother, who had always sworn by simple remedies. Warm lemon water for colds, chamomile tea for restless nights. It seemed fitting that they, now seniors themselves, were carrying on a tradition that stretched even further back. Not just through their family, but through generations of people who had trusted small, natural things to hold them steady. The more Tiffany thought about it, the more she realized her spoonful was less about fighting illness and more about honoring her body. She had feared for so long that aging meant surrendering, giving up strength, independence, and vitality. But each sip reminded her otherwise. She might not be young, but she was not powerless, and perhaps that was why this little ritual had endured through time. It wasn't about quick cures, it was about giving the body a quiet ally, something steady and reliable, something that reminded you to believe in your own resilience. That night, as she set the vinegar bottle back on the shelf, Tiffany whispered a quiet thank you, not just to the bottle, but to the long line of people who had carried this habit before her. From warriors who drank it to prepare for battle, to healers who used it as a tonic, to seniors like herself searching for steadiness in later years, the thread was unbroken. And in that realization, Tiffany felt less like an old woman fighting fatigue and more like a participant in a much larger story. A story of endurance, a story of survival, a story of why, even now, one spoon could still matter. Tiffany had never cared much about her weight when she was younger. Life had been busy then, raising children, cooking hearty meals, and baking pies for church gatherings. Her figure had changed over the years, but she had worn it with quiet acceptance. What troubled her now, at 68, wasn't vanity, but the heaviness she carried around her waist and thighs. It wasn't just how her clothes fit, it was the way her knees ached when she climbed the stairs, the shortness of breath after bending in the garden. Her doctor had called it visceral fat, the kind that wraps itself around the organs, invisible but dangerous. Tiffany only knew that it made her feel older than her years. One afternoon, she pulled out a dress she hadn't worn in months. The fabric clung too tightly at her midsection, and the sight made her sigh. That night, she looked at the vinegar bottle again, almost as if it were an old friend. She had read that the acids and fibers inside it, things with strange names like acetic acid and pectin, helped the body feel fuller, slowed down the way sugar turned into fat, and even nudged the body to burn through stored weight. For Tiffany, these weren't just scientific details, they were hope. Hope that her body could shed the heaviness that weighed down her spirit. She didn't expect miracles, and she wasn't trying to become someone she used to be. But within weeks of her daily ritual, Tiffany noticed she didn't crave snacks between meals as often. The urge to reach for cookies after lunch dulled, and when she looked at her plate, she found herself satisfied with less. Even Anna noticed. "Mom, you didn't even finish your plate tonight," she said one evening. Tiffany smiled gently, shrugging, "I guess I'm just not as hungry anymore." What she didn't say was how much lighter she felt afterward, how she could move through the evening without that heavy cloud of sluggishness pulling her down. It wasn't just the eating. Tiffany began to walk farther each evening, first down to the corner, then around the block, and eventually through the small park near her house. The air felt cooler on her skin, her steps more confident. One day she caught herself laughing at Ethan as he ran circles around her. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she had energy to play along. Each step reminded her that the fat clinging to her body was not just about appearance, it was about freedom. Freedom to move, to bend, to laugh without the ache of exhaustion. At her next doctor's visit, the nurse weighed her, and Tiffany was startled to see the number dip a little lower than before. It wasn't dramatic, just a few pounds, but it felt like a victory. The doctor noticed too, raising his eyebrows with a small smile. "Whatever you're doing, keep at it," he said. Tiffany nodded, though she kept the vinegar her quiet secret. Not because she was ashamed, but because it felt personal, like a promise she had made to herself each morning, a sacred ritual between her and her health. Margaret, curious as ever, called again to ask if the vinegar had really made a difference. Tiffany chuckled into the phone. "It's not like I'm 20 again," she said softly, "but I feel lighter, and not just in my body." Margaret grew quiet, and Tiffany could almost hear her sister thinking. "Lighter in your heart too?" she asked. Tiffany smiled. "Exactly. In truth, the ritual was teaching her more than she expected. It wasn't about losing weight quickly, but about shedding something deeper, the weight of fear, the burden of believing change was impossible after 60. Each spoonful reminded her that her body could still respond, still surprise her, still let go of what no longer served it. And as the weeks passed, the dress that once clung too tightly began to fit again, not perfectly, but enough to remind Tiffany that she was moving forward. That small daily act, so simple and unassuming, was quietly reshaping her life. It wasn't just melting hidden fat, it was melting the doubts that had crept in with age. Tiffany had discovered that one spoon each morning wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual of renewal, a daily whisper that her best days weren't behind her. They were still unfolding, one step, one sip, one lighter breath at a time. Tiffany had lived with the quiet worry of diabetes for years. Her doctor never called her diabetic, but the warnings had been there. Borderline, pre-diabetic, watch your numbers. Each time she left the clinic, she promised herself she would be more careful. Yet life had a way of slipping back into old habits. She would nibble on a piece of bread at dinner, a small dessert at church gatherings, or sweet tea on warm afternoons. The sugar never seemed dangerous in the moment, but the dizzy spells and sudden drops of energy told her otherwise. It was during one of those moments, when her legs felt weak after a heavy meal, that she sat at the kitchen table with her vinegar glass. She sipped slowly, breathing in the sharp scent, and thought about what she had read. Acetic acid, the very thing that gave vinegar its sour bite, could help her body slow down the way it absorbed sugar. It wasn't a cure, but it acted like a gatekeeper, letting the body handle food more gently instead of flooding her blood with sudden spikes. For Tiffany, the idea felt less like science and more like mercy. The changes came quietly, almost too subtle to notice at first. But after a few weeks, Tiffany realized she wasn't crashing into the same fog after meals. She could finish lunch and still have the energy to fold laundry or walk to the mailbox without feeling drained. Even her hands, which once trembled when her sugar swung too high or too low, seemed steadier. It wasn't perfection. She still had moments of fatigue, but the extremes were softening, smoothing out like ripples on a calm pond. One afternoon, Anna stopped by unannounced. She found her mother sweeping the porch, humming softly to herself. "Mom, you're out here working in the heat?" Anna asked, worried. Tiffany leaned on her broom and smiled. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." Her daughter looked at her, puzzled. Tiffany didn't explain the vinegar just then. She wanted to hold the secret a little longer, but she knew the difference was real. Her body was steadier, her days more even, and the fear that once shadowed her mealtimes had begun to lift. At her next appointment, the doctor pricked her finger and checked her blood. He frowned for a moment, then looked at her with a touch of surprise. "Your glucose levels are more stable than before," he said. "What have you been doing differently?" Tiffany hesitated. Should she tell him? She smiled faintly and said, "I've just been paying closer attention." It was true, though she knew it wasn't only about food choices, it was also about that small spoonful of vinegar that had become her anchor. Later that week, Tiffany finally shared her secret with Margaret during their evening call. "I think the vinegar is helping my sugar," she admitted. Margaret laughed, but then asked curiously, "Do you really believe one spoon can do all that?" Tiffany thought about it carefully. "It's not just the vinegar," she said softly. "It's the way it reminds me to care for myself every single morning. It's a ritual that keeps me steady, and somehow my body feels steady too." That night, Tiffany sat by her window with her journal. She wrote about the day she had nearly collapsed in her kitchen, the doctor's warning, the fear that had followed her like a shadow. Then she wrote about the small victories, the steadier mornings, the lighter afternoons, the doctor's surprised expression when her numbers improved. She realized the vinegar had given her something more precious than just balance in her blood. It had given her balance in her spirit. And as she closed the journal, Tiffany whispered to herself, "So this is what stable feels like." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy, but it was life-changing in the quietest way. She no longer feared every bite of food, no longer waited for the dizziness to return. The vinegar, that simple spoon, had become a thread stitching her days together with calm steadiness. And for Tiffany, that steadiness was more than medicine. It was freedom. For as long as Tiffany could remember, her stomach had been her most unpredictable companion. Some days, even the simplest meal left her bloated and restless. On others, she battled sharp cramps that would come and go without warning, forcing her to lie down until they passed. She had grown used to carrying peppermint tea in her purse, nibbling dry crackers in the middle of the night, and politely declining invitations to eat out with friends. "It's just my stomach," she would say with a small smile, though inside it felt like a chain that kept her tethered to discomfort. But a month into her vinegar ritual, Tiffany began to notice something curious. The heavy sensation that usually followed her meals didn't linger as long. The gas and bloating that had once made her self-conscious eased, leaving her feeling lighter. She wasn't cured, she still had days of discomfort, but the difference was undeniable. One evening, after finishing a bowl of vegetable soup, she sat back in her chair and realized she wasn't dreading the familiar ache. Instead, she felt calm, almost soothed. She remembered reading that vinegar contained acetic acid, which could help her stomach break down food more efficiently. It also carried antimicrobial properties that fought against the bad bacteria often responsible for stomach upset. Tiffany didn't think in terms of enzymes and microbiomes. Those were words that belonged in medical journals. What she understood was the simple truth. Her meals no longer felt like battles, and her evenings no longer ended in pain. Anna noticed the change during one Sunday dinner. Tiffany helped herself to a second serving of roasted chicken, something she hadn't dared in years. "Mom, you're eating more than me tonight," Anna laughed. Tiffany chuckled, resting her fork. "I suppose I'm just enjoying myself again." She didn't tell her daughter that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what the meal would cost her later. That freedom, small as it seemed, was more nourishing than the food itself. Her sister Margaret, always curious, asked how it felt. Tiffany tried to put it into words. "It's like My stomach isn't angry with me anymore, she said softly over the phone. Margaret grew quiet, then admitted she had been avoiding certain foods because of her own discomfort. Maybe it's time I tried your little spoon too, she whispered. Tiffany smiled, glad that her quiet ritual was beginning to ripple outward, touching even those she loved. One evening, Tiffany sat in her armchair after dinner, listening to the hum of cicadas outside the window. She placed her hand over her belly and thought about all the years she had endured its unrest. It struck her how often she had accepted pain as inevitable, as if aging meant surrendering to suffering without question. Yet here she was, discovering comfort in something as small as a tablespoon of vinegar. It wasn't a cure, but it was kindness. Kindness to her body, kindness to herself. Her doctor, when she mentioned her stomach felt calmer, nodded thoughtfully. Digestion often slows as we get older, he explained, but sometimes the simplest habits support it better than medication can. Tiffany didn't need more convincing. She knew what her body was telling her. Each day, the vinegar was helping her reclaim a piece of peace she had lost long ago. By the end of that month, Tiffany felt braver at the table. She tried new recipes, enjoyed dinners with her grandchildren, and even accepted an invitation to eat out with friends. For once, she wasn't carrying fear in her stomach, only gratitude. The vinegar had soothed more than just digestion. It had soothed the part of her heart that believed aging meant narrowing her life, shrinking her choices, and living within invisible limits. Now, with each meal, she felt her world widening again, one comfortable evening at a time. The first time Tiffany worried about her heart, she was 56. It was a winter morning, and she had been shoveling the driveway when a deep pressure tightened across her chest. It passed quickly, but the memory stayed with her, sharp as frost. Since then, every ache, every skipped beat carried a shadow of fear. Her doctor had told her she had high cholesterol, a family tendency. Her father had died from a heart attack at 71. Tiffany often wondered if her own life would end the same way. That fear had followed her into every clinic visit, every blood test, every lecture about diet and exercise. Even when she smiled politely, she carried the weight of her father's story inside her. And yet, as she sat by her kitchen window one morning, sipping her vinegar water, she realized she hadn't thought about her heart in weeks. Not because the fear was gone, but because her body was beginning to feel lighter, calmer, more alive. It was as though a quiet strength was building beneath her ribs. She had read once that vinegar's natural acids, combined with its antioxidants, helped reduce the buildup of fats in the blood. Words like LDL cholesterol and triglycerides didn't mean much to her on paper, but she understood the picture. Her arteries, like little rivers, staying clearer, less clogged. She imagined them carrying life through her body, unobstructed, strong. It gave her comfort to think that each morning spoon was helping keep those rivers flowing, guarding her heart the way time and fear once threatened to weaken it. One afternoon, while walking in the park with Anna, Tiffany noticed how much easier her breathing felt. The hill that once left her short of breath no longer seemed so steep. "You're keeping up with me, Mom," Anna laughed, surprised. Tiffany smiled, a little breathless but proud. "Maybe I'm just stronger than I thought." She didn't mention the vinegar, at least not yet, but she knew the truth. Her little ritual was giving her the courage to walk farther, to push gently against the limits she had once accepted. Her doctor's words at the next checkup lingered with her. "Your blood pressure is steadier and your cholesterol has dipped a little," he said, studying her chart. "It looks like you're moving in the right direction." Tiffany nodded, hiding the smile tugging at her lips. She remembered her father's funeral, the heavy silence of loss, the way her heart had ached with grief. And now, years later, she carried a quiet victory inside her, an act of defiance against the family history that haunted her. That evening, Tiffany sat with Margaret on the phone, describing the changes she felt. "I don't know if it's all the vinegar," she admitted, "but I feel like my heart isn't as heavy. I'm not carrying that same fear every day." Margaret grew quiet, then whispered, "Do you think that's why it's lasted so long, this little remedy? Because it reminds people they still have some control?" Tiffany thought about it, then answered, "Yes, it doesn't erase the years, but it gives me a way forward, a way to believe my heart can stay strong." Later that night, Tiffany lay in bed listening to the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt its calm thrum beneath her palm. For years, she'd heard it as a reminder of fragility, as if each beat might be the one to falter. But now she heard it differently. Each beat was a promise. Each beat was a sign of endurance. And with every spoon of vinegar, she felt as though she was adding strength to that rhythm, keeping it clear, steady, and alive. The truth was, Tiffany didn't know how many years remained ahead of her. None of us do. But she knew this. Her days no longer felt overshadowed by the fear of her heart giving out too soon. Instead, she moved forward with the hope that her arteries could stay open, her blood could flow freely, and her life could continue with strength. Her ritual had become more than a habit. It had become a safeguard, a quiet shield. And as she drifted to sleep that night, she whispered to herself, "Stronger heart, longer life." It was no longer just a wish, it was something she could feel, pulsing steadily within her chest, carrying her toward more mornings, more laughter, and more life yet to be lived. For years, Tiffany's nights had been the hardest part of her days. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Midnight would come and go, her thoughts circling back to worries she couldn't silence, the doctor's warnings, the faces of her children, the ache of her aging body. By morning, she felt as though she had lived 2 days instead of one, her strength drained before the sun even rose. She had tried everything: lavender on her pillow, chamomile tea, soft music, even counting backwards from 100. Nothing seemed to quiet her restless mind. Her daughter often teased that she was part owl, awake through the night, but Tiffany knew the toll it was taking. Without sleep, even the simplest tasks felt overwhelming. Her bones ached, her memory slipped, and her spirit sagged under the weight of exhaustion. One evening, while preparing her vinegar ritual for the next morning, she paused. She remembered something she had read about combining vinegar with honey before bed, a simple drink that could ease the body into rest. It sounded almost too easy, but she decided to try. She stirred a spoon of vinegar and a small drizzle of honey into warm water, watching the golden threads dissolve into the liquid. The scent was sharp, but softened by the sweetness, and for the first time in months, she felt curious about bedtime instead of dreading it. That night, after sipping the mixture, Tiffany climbed into bed. The usual parade of thoughts began, but something was different. Her body felt heavier, her breath slower. It was as if a gentle hand had pressed pause on the constant spinning of her mind. She drifted off more quickly than she had in years, waking hours later to the soft light of morning slipping through her curtains. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented. Then it hit her, she had slept through the night. The following evenings, she repeated the ritual. A spoon of vinegar, a spoon of honey, sometimes stirred into chamomile tea if she wanted extra comfort. The effect wasn't dramatic every night, but the difference was real. Sleep came easier, and when it did, it was deeper. She no longer woke 3 or 4 times, gasping for rest. Instead, her nights stretched into something she had forgotten was possible: peace. One morning, Anna called early, surprised to find her mother cheerful at such an hour. "You sound different," she said. Tiffany laughed softly, telling her she had actually slept. Anna grew quiet, then whispered, "I'm glad, Mom. You needed that." Tiffany could hear the relief in her daughter's voice, and it touched her. Rest was not only a gift for herself, it was a gift for her family, who no longer had to watch her stumble through her days like a shadow of herself. Her sister Margaret was curious as always. "Do you really think that vinegar of yours is helping you sleep?" she asked over the phone. Tiffany thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe it's not just the vinegar. Maybe it's the way it calms me, the way it reminds me I'm doing something gentle for myself before I close my eyes." Margaret chuckled, but Tiffany could tell she was listening closely. After all, Margaret too had spoken of her restless nights. Perhaps she would soon follow Tiffany's example. As the weeks went on, Tiffany noticed how her entire life seemed brighter with better rest. Her mornings were no longer clouded with fatigue. Her memory felt sharper, her mood steadier. She found herself humming as she cooked breakfast, tending her plants with more patience, even enjoying the evening news without nodding off in her chair. The exhaustion that once clung to her like a heavy coat was slowly slipping away. One evening, she sat on her porch as the sun set, sipping her honeyed vinegar drink. The cicadas sang, the sky glowed orange, and Tiffany felt something she hadn't felt in years: readiness for rest. Not dread, not frustration, but readiness. It was a simple thing, almost too simple, yet it carried the weight of transformation. As she climbed into bed that night, she thought of all the years she had fought against sleep, all the nights spent longing for peace. Now, with her quiet ritual, she felt as though she had discovered a secret key to unlock the rest her body had been begging for. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Tonight I will rest." And this time she did. Tiffany had grown used to the mirror as an adversary. Each year, she watched new lines etch themselves across her face, her once bright hair thinning into silver strands, her skin turning dull under the weight of time. She wasn't vain, she never cared for creams or fancy treatments, but there was a sadness in seeing her reflection grow tired, older, as though her spirit was fading from the surface. Some mornings she avoided the mirror altogether, not wanting to see the reminder of years she could never reclaim. But one morning, after rinsing her face, Tiffany noticed something unusual. Her skin, though still marked by age, seemed softer, less clouded. She leaned closer, curious. The patch of dryness on her cheek had eased, and the redness that often flared around her chin had quieted. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Later, while brushing her hair, she realized the strands looked shinier, less weighed down by oil or dullness. She touched them gently, surprised by the small but welcome change. She remembered reading that vinegar's natural acids could cleanse the skin, tightening pores and fighting off the little bacteria that caused irritation. It could also rebalance the scalp, restoring shine and strength to hair. Tiffany smiled at the thought, something so ordinary, so inexpensive, doing what the countless bottles in the drugstore promised but never delivered. She wasn't chasing youth anymore, but she felt grateful for any touch of lightness that softened the edges of age. Anna noticed it first. One afternoon, as Tiffany sat in the garden, her daughter said, "Mom, your face looks brighter somehow. Did you change something?" Tiffany laughed, brushing off the question, but inside she felt a quiet thrill. She hadn't expected others to see it. It wasn't makeup or tricks, it was her body responding, her skin and hair whispering thanks for the care she had begun to give herself. Her sister Margaret, too, was quick to comment. "You sound different on the phone," she said, "lighter, younger even." Tiffany smiled into the receiver. "Maybe it's because I feel better," she replied. But later that night, she wondered if it wasn't more than feeling. Perhaps the vinegar had reached deeper, reviving not just her spirit, but her appearance as well. It wasn't about vanity for Tiffany. She didn't expect to erase decades, nor did she want to. But she found a quiet joy in looking in the mirror and seeing a spark instead of a shadow. Her skin glowed in ways it hadn't in years. Her hair carried a shine that made her feel put together again. And with those changes came confidence, the kind she thought belonged only to younger women. She began to wear her favorite scarves again, not to hide, but to adorn. She sat straighter in her chair, smiled more easily when neighbors passed. One Sunday at church, a friend leaned close and whispered, "Tiffany, you look wonderful. What's your secret?" Tiffany chuckled softly, her hand brushing the hem of her dress. "Just a spoonful of something old and ordinary," she answered. The woman raised her brows in confusion, but Tiffany left it at that. She liked the idea of her little ritual being her private fountain of youth, a secret that tied her to generations before her and, perhaps, gave her the strength to face the years ahead. More than anything, Tiffany realized the change wasn't only in her skin or hair, it was in how she carried herself. The vinegar had given her back a sense of vitality that radiated outward, touching not only her reflection, but her presence. She laughed more freely, met people's eyes with ease, and even caught herself humming as she walked through the market. She was no longer hiding from her age. Instead, she was stepping into it with grace, her spirit shining through the lines on her face. That night, as she brushed her hair, Tiffany paused in front of the mirror. The silver strands gleamed under the light, her skin soft and calm. She smiled at her reflection, not in longing for the past, but in gratitude for the present. She whispered to herself, "I look like me again." And in that moment, she realized that sometimes the truest beauty comes not from erasing years, but from nurturing the life that still glows within them. Tiffany had grown so accustomed to her daily ritual that it felt as natural as brushing her teeth. Each morning and many nights, she reached for the bottle without thinking twice, pouring her spoonful into warm water as if it were second nature. She loved the steadiness it gave her, the peace it had brought back to her days. Yet one afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table with Margaret, she heard a story that made her pause. Margaret had tried the vinegar herself, eager to share in her sister's new lightness. But instead of relief, she complained of a sore throat and a burning in her stomach. "I think I overdid it," she admitted with a sigh. "I thought if one spoon worked, then maybe 2 or 3 would work faster." Tiffany's eyes widened. She hadn't considered that possibility before. The vinegar had always been a comfort to her, but hearing Margaret's discomfort reminded her that even good things could turn dangerous when misused. That evening, Tiffany thought back to her doctor's advice, not about vinegar specifically, but about life in general. Moderation, he had always said. Your body needs balance more than anything else. She realized that her vinegar ritual was no different. A single spoon had brought her comfort, but doubling or tripling it could be more harmful than healing. Too much acid could upset her stomach, wear down her teeth, or even weaken her bones over time. The next morning, Tiffany swirled her spoon of vinegar in water with new reverence. She rinsed her mouth afterward, remembering what she had read about protecting tooth enamel. She waited before brushing, knowing her teeth needed time. It wasn't just about drinking the vinegar anymore, it was about respecting it, using it as an ally rather than pushing it to do more than it was meant to give. Anna noticed her mother's carefulness one day when Tiffany reached for the bottle. "You're still on your vinegar kick, huh?" she teased. Tiffany smiled softly. "Yes, but I've learned to be gentle with it. Too much of a good thing can turn against you." Anna raised her brows, impressed at the wisdom in her mother's tone. Tiffany knew it wasn't wisdom so much as experience. The lesson that healing comes not only from what you take in, but from how you choose to honor your limits. A week later, Tiffany spoke to her doctor about her ritual. She admitted she had been drinking a spoon each day and had seen changes in her digestion, sleep, and energy. To her surprise, the doctor didn't dismiss her. He simply nodded and said, "It can help as long as you're cautious. Don't overdo it and always listen to your body." Those words settled deep in Tiffany's heart. She wasn't foolish for trying, she was wise for learning when to stop. That night, as she prepared her evening drink with honey, she thought about all the years she had chased quick fixes, new diets, new pills, promises of youth in bottles and boxes. They had left her disappointed, sometimes even harmed. But this was different. The vinegar was not about chasing youth or defying age. It was about steady companionship, a small reminder that her body could still thrive. And like any true companion, it needed to be respected, not abused. Margaret called again, her voice softer this time. "I went back to just one spoon," she said, "and it feels better. You were right. It's not about more, it's about enough." Tiffany smiled, proud of her sister for finding balance. Together they laughed, remembering how their mother used to scold them as girls. Too much sugar will rot your teeth. Now, decades later, the lesson was the same. Too much of anything could undo the good it promised. As Tiffany lay in bed that night, she reflected on her journey. The vinegar had given her back lightness, steadiness, and hope. But the greater gift was the reminder that healing comes with boundaries. She didn't need more, faster, or stronger. She needed steady, gentle, and enough. She whispered to herself as sleep came, "One spoon, not more." And in that whisper, she carried both gratitude and wisdom, the kind of wisdom that comes only from living, learning, and listening to the quiet truth of her own body. Looking back on Tiffany's journey, it's clear that her transformation was never about chasing miracles, but about embracing one small, steady change. What began as a forgotten bottle tucked away in her kitchen became a quiet ritual that touched nearly every part of her life. She felt her energy return, her digestion calm, her sleep deepen, and even her heart grow steadier. Perhaps most importantly, she discovered that healing after 60 wasn't about turning back the clock. It was about choosing to live forward with hope. Her story is a reminder that true change doesn't need to come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's hidden in the simplest habits. A spoonful of courage, a sip of faith, a choice repeated every day. Tiffany's glass of vinegar water was never just a drink. It was a symbol of her willingness to believe that her body still had strength to give, and her years ahead could be filled with vitality rather than decline. And now the invitation extends to all of us. What small act could you welcome into your life today? Not as a quick fix, but as a companion for your journey. Maybe it's a gentle ritual, maybe it's a shift in mindset. But whatever it is, let it remind you that you're not powerless. No matter your age, change is still possible, and healing can still begin in ways you never expected. So let Tiffany's story linger with you tonight. Let it whisper to you the truth she discovered for herself. That strength and hope often arrive in the quietest forms. Sometimes they come in a single spoonful, enough to carry you forward, enough to remind you that your best days can still be ahead.